Hello, and thank you for joining me for this webinar on ASCA Ethical Standards in Comprehensive School Counseling Programs. I am Sarah Kirk, and I am the School Counselor Specialist at the Oklahoma State Department of Education, and I am a lover of all things school counseling. I truly believe in the work that you all do as school counselors, and so does our office. We are the Student Support Division of the Oklahoma State Department of Education, and we are here to support our schools, family, students, and of course, you lovely school counselors. Today, we're talking ethics, not everyone's favorite topic, but an important one nonetheless. ASCA has the ethical standards that we abide by as school counselors. So we will be diving into where those fit into the ASCA National Model, what they are, how to implement them, do a little bit of reflecting, and we will summarize. As always, we want to be aware of letting perfect be the enemy of good. We are here to learn about ways to strengthen our school counseling programs, never expecting perfection, but certainly striving to do what's best for our students, especially when it comes to ethics. It is so important that we abide by our ethical standards in all that we do, even when it might go against our personal beliefs. We are no longer Sarah Kirk person. We are now Sarah Kirk school counselor, and we must abide by those ethical standards that define our school counseling profession. So let's get started. We know that the ASCA National Model is our framework for school counseling programs. It outlines what we need to do as school counselors to build programs that have a positive impact on student achievement, attendance, and discipline. The domains are academic, social, emotional, and college and career. The themes that make up the national model are advocacy, collaboration, leadership, and systemic change. The components are define, manage, deliver, and assess, seen there in the square. And together, this creates a data-driven national model that supports all students, which of course is our goal. When we implement a school counseling program that is guided by the ASCA National Model, our decisions are data informed. We are delivering student services to all students, not just some students, which includes a developmentally appropriate curriculum and interventions and supports to close achievement gaps and opportunity gaps. And of course, that results in improved student achievement, attendance, and discipline. So when we look at that square there that has our four components on it, define, manage, deliver, and assess, we know that makes up what it is that we need to be doing as school counselors to implement the national model. You'll see that information on this slide, just in more detail about what is included in each of those components. So today we're talking about the ethical standards, which falls under the define component. The define component includes 3 sets of standards that are the defining documents of the school counseling profession. Without these 3 sets of documents, we don't have a profession of school counseling. These sets of standards help us develop, implement, and assess a school counseling program. They guide the way. They define what we should be doing. The 3 documents are the student standards, the ASCA ethical standards, and the school counselor professional standards and competencies. So of course, today we're talking about the ethical standards. So let's talk about them. The ASCA ethical standards are they specify the principles of ethical behavior, right? I think that's pretty obvious. Most of us have a pretty good grasp on why we have ethical standards. They are necessary so that we maintain the highest standard of integrity, leadership, and professionalism. They guide our decision-making and help standardize professional practice to protect our students and also us as school counselors. I love this idea of standardizing professional practice because that goes back to what I mentioned, that no longer do our personal beliefs have any place or any need here, because that is not what matters. We are here to provide standardized professional practices to our students. Now, of course, that doesn't mean that we are meant to be robots responding in the exact same way to every student. Of course not. But we must abide by our ethical standards, and everything we do must be within those standards, because those specify the principles and what our behavior should look like. Our ASCA ethical standards serve as a guide, as we said, not only for us, though, as school counselors, but also as our supervisors and our directors. They include information about their role and their ethical guidelines, as well as and then also school counselor educators. So it's important that all the elements of school counseling, everyone who touches school counseling, understands that these ethical standards guide all of our practices. It's also important to understand that these standards are maintained regardless of what level you are at. So you cannot say, well, I'm an elementary school counselor. That doesn't apply to me. These are meant to be implemented by all school counselors. We also cannot say that our area or our population served allows us to be disconnected or not required to abide by these. Now, all of us are obligated to abide by the ethical standards of our profession. Also very important, and I've heard this one before, even though they are called the ASCA ethical standards, they are in fact the ethical standards for all school counselors. They define the school counseling profession. Regardless of if you are a member of ASCA or not, you must follow the ethical standards because you are certified and in the position of a school counselor. Your membership in the organization does not impact your obligation to follow the standards. The ASCA ethical standards also help provide support and direction for our self-assessment, our peer consultation and evaluations regarding our responsibilities to students, to caregivers, to colleagues, to professional associates, school district employees, communities, and the school counseling professions. They just give us that support and direction that we need. And they also inform our stakeholders of our role and what should be expected from a school counseling professional. This can be a really strong advocacy tool because it shows what we should be doing and as appropriate roles of the school counselor. It also outlines things we should not be doing as a school counselor. For example, the ethical standards indicate that school counselors should provide short-term counseling services. We are not meant to provide long-term mental health support, and our ethical standards state that. And so they can be an advocacy tool if we're being asked to do something outside of our scope as school counselors. So before we get to implementation steps, I would like to jump over and take a look at these ethical standards. I hope that you have seen them many, many times before, but if not, we're going to spend just a second looking at them. These can easily be found on ASCA's website. So I encourage you to have a copy very handy at all times. I always kept several handy. You can see here that they were adopted in 1984. They've been around for quite some time and revised every 6 years since then. They are revised on a 6-year rotation. So we will get new ones actually next year in 2022. They have already begun the process for revising these ethical standards. So be on the lookout for those to be released next summer. All right, so if you have not taken a look at these, again, I'm not going to read it all to you. They are 12 pages long. I don't think you want that, but I encourage you to read them on your own time. This preamble is really powerful. I always included this on my website and different things like that because it really outlines our role as school counselors, and not everyone understands what that role is. It goes into a little bit of detail about the purpose of ethical standards, like what we talked about today, to guide us, but also to help stakeholders and other people understand what it is that our role is and our professional obligations are. All right, then it gets into the actual ethical standards, starting here with a responsibility to students. So you can see here that the statements are written as things school counselors should do because they are our ethical standards. So we talk about that a lot in this defined component. We have those three sets of standards: the student standards, which is what we want our students to do as a result of our school counseling program. We have our school counselor standards, which is what we actually do, like our day-to-day activities. And then our ethical standards really outline the ethical obligation piece. Now, if you look at the ethical standards and the school counselor professional standards and competencies, you'll see a lot of overlap because our standards and our competencies overlap with our ethical standards. But ethical standards really dive deeper into the ethical obligation piece. So we want to make sure we have both, because as school counselors, we abide by both documents, our competencies and standards and our ethical standards. Does that make sense? And then that third one, the student standards, that's what we want our students to be as a result of our program. All right. So you can see here the first section about the responsibility to students, starting with supporting student development, going into confidentiality. I highly encourage you to take a look at confidentiality. I often get questions about this, about breaking confidentiality and telling parents about conversations. And this is very, very, very clear in that confidentiality should not be broken unless there is harm to self or others. The question I often get is if a student were to come out as gay or lesbian or other identities to you, do you have an ethical obligation to report that to parents? The answer is very clear, no. It is not harming them or others, and our ethical obligation resides in our confidentiality to the student. Remember, keep in mind, these ethical standards are written for all school counselors at all levels, including elementary, middle, and high school. All right, this next section talks about a data-informed program. So not only is that a best practice, but it is an ethical obligation as well. And you'll see here, it goes into those three domains of academic, career, and social emotional. You can hear that my dog gets very worked up over ethical standards as well. So we all love these ethical standards. Now, I think he's more worked up that the mail delivery people are here, but anyway. All right, so then going into A5, dual relationships and managing boundaries, also some really important information. I encourage you to check that out, especially if you perhaps are a therapist on the side and how to manage those potential dual relationships. Referrals and advocacy, very important pieces, those indirect student services that we provide, but very valuable to our students. Group work, student peer support programs, serious and foreseeable harm to self and others, also very important to make sure we are reading and staying up to date on our ethical obligation when it comes to harm to self or others. At-risk populations, bullying, harassment, and child abuse. Student records, we get a lot of questions about that as well, so check that out. Evaluation, assessment, and interpretation, technical and digital citizenship, virtual school counseling. We were certainly glad we had this included in our ethical standards when everyone went virtual, and I know some of you still are, so make sure you understand your ethical obligations as a virtual school counselor. Right, and so then it gets into section B, which is responsibilities to parents, guardians, school, and self. So we already talked about our responsibilities to student, and next we talk about to parents, guardians, school, and self. And it's broken up into each of those. So first, school counselor responsibilities to parents and guardians. Then it goes into the responsibilities to the school and to self. Right. So again, these are really strong advocacy tools. I just noticed as I was going that B to C right here, calls us to advocate for a school counseling program free of non-school counseling assignments as identified by the ASCA National Model. So it is not only important that we advocate on behalf of our students, but we have to advocate on behalf of ourselves to get those non-school counseling duties removed from our plates. You'll also see here, again, I mentioned there was a lot of overlap. It is important that our responsibilities to our school is that we're providing those supports and that program. It is absolutely an ethical obligation. We are not just there as a placeholder or, to deal with what comes up. We are there to provide a comprehensive school counseling program as outlined in these ethical standards. Right, we do have responsibilities to ourselves as a school counselor as well. You can read there in B3. Then section C gets into school counselor administrators or supervisors. So if you are in a leadership position, you will want to make sure that you are familiar with section C. Section D is if you are an intern site supervisor. So if you have an intern with you, you want to make sure that you abide by section D. Section E is the maintenance of standards. So this just outlines what it is that we need to do if there is a doubt as to if the ethical behavior of a colleague, what we should do in that situation. Maybe you work with another school counselor, then you would use section E to understand how to respond to a colleague who is not following the ethical standards. And then section F is really important. I think people don't always know this is here, but it is an ethical decision-making model created by Dr. Carolyn Stone, and it's the STEPS model. STEP stands for Solutions to Ethical Problems in Schools. And this is let's see, how many steps is it? I believe it's a 9-step ethical decision-making model that can outline what to do when you find yourself in a sticky situation, which it's not it's not if you will find yourself in a sticky situation, it's when. So make sure you have these resources handy. There are other ethical decision-making models out there if you're interested in exploring others, if this one doesn't feel like a good fit to you. A quick Google on ethical decision-making models will bring up many research articles on many different ethical decision-making models. And then the last thing included in our ethical standards are glossary of terms, which can be really helpful as you're reading through those ethical standards. Make sure you understand what is meant by some of those terms. All right. So those are our ethical standards. Again, they'll be updated soon, but I don't anticipate them changing dramatically as they still really, even though they are about 5 years old, they still really hold true to our obligations as school counselors. All right. Let's get back to our presentation. As I mentioned, I strongly encourage that you have those handy in your office, maybe a couple of different copies of them. You never know when it will come in handy to have them around. All right, so implementation steps. We, of course, want to practice in accordance with the ASCA ethical standards, always, always, always. We want to adhere to the legal responsibilities of the role of the school counselor. Adhere to the ethical limits of confidentiality. We mentioned that. Fulfill our legal and ethical obligations to not only our students, but their families, teachers, and administrators as well. Consult with school counselors and other education, counseling, and legal professionals as needed. Resolve ethical dilemmas by using an ethical decision-making model. I mentioned the one included in the ASCA ethical standards, but there are others. Model ethical behavior, absolutely. And making sure we engage in continual professional development, so important. Many of the School Counselor Association conferences will include an ethics piece. So be sure and check those out. If you're ever at your state or national conference, make sure you check out those ethical obligations and ethical standards professional development opportunities. They often highlight hot topics that are really important. The other way to get really helpful, relevant professional development regarding ethics is through ASCA. Dr. Carolyn Stone, who I mentioned, was the author of the ethical decision-making model. She is also the chair of the ethics committee. She is brilliant, absolutely brilliant. I've heard her speak many times, and I always leave absolutely amazed by everything she knows, because she knows so much about school counseling, but she also knows so much about the legal system and the law that can impact our work as school counselors. She has so many stories because she's called on from the courts often. When a school counselor finds themselves in hot water, she is the one who is often consulted as our ASCA ethical chair. She is often consulted in courtrooms, and she says that these standards, they hold up in a court of law. If we are following these, we will not find ourselves in trouble. But if we are not following these and we find ourselves in hot water, it doesn't always end how we want it. So these are really, really important. And keeping in mind that these stand up even if we're not members. We cannot go to court and say, well, we didn't follow the ethical standards because we're not ASCA members. These are our profession's standards, our ethical standards that we all must follow in everything we do. So making sure we understand that. But what I started to mention is Dr. Stone, who is a genius and who does speak on ethical standards and different ethical dilemmas very frequently, but she also writes in the ASCA School Counselor magazine that comes out. So every time there is an article that she has written that is really targeting a hot topic. So she's written a lot about virtual school counseling recently and culturally sustaining school counseling and different pieces like that that might be really relevant in the current moment. So I encourage you, if you're an ASCA member, you should get that magazine, check out those articles, read them, keep them. I have several of them on my bookshelf behind me because I consult with them frequently, because they have a lot of really good information that I don't always know how to handle. So I am greatly, greatly appreciative of Dr. Stone's work and the expertise she shares with us and with our profession. So in reflection, we want to continue to foster growth in the implementation of the ASCA ethical standards by reflecting on this question. How do the ASCA ethical standards for school counselors inform your practice? They should be informing everything you do, truly. And if they don't, how can we work towards the ethical standards informing our practice? What steps do we need to take? Think about that. Think about what you can do. Think about where you can grow and make sure you take steps to grow in that area. So in summary, we define the profession of school counseling by these three sets of standards: our ASCA student standards, our ASCA school counselor professional standards and competencies, and the ASCA ethical standards. Today, we have really spent a lot of time diving into those ASCA ethical standards, but if you have questions about the student standards or the school counselor professional standards, be sure and check out the webinars on those topics. The ASCA ethical standards for school counselors specify the principles of ethical behavior necessary to maintain the highest standard of integrity, leadership, and professionalism. They guide school counselors' decision-making and help standardize professional practice to protect both students and school counselors. While it may not be the most fun topic to talk about, it is vitally important. It is absolutely defining all we do as school counselors. So please make sure you're familiar with these. Please stay in the know about where your weaknesses are, where you really have a lot of understanding, and seek professional development in those areas that are a little more unclear to you. Most likely they're unclear to others too, me included. There are some tricky topics, and that's why we have our ethical standards to guide us, so that those sticky, tricky topics are a little less tricky. We have a guiding document to define what we should do as school counselors. As always, we have to ask ourselves what's best for students, and that answer always leads us to the right decision. If I can do anything to help, please reach out. Email, phone is included. And as always, as my good friend Mr. Rogers says, there are people like you who see a need and respond, and I consider those people my heroes. Thank you for being a hero in our schools every single day. I cannot thank you enough for your service, and our schools and our students are so much better because of it. Have a great day, and I will see you again soon. Bye-bye.